This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
As we continue to look at Donald Trump's return to the White House, we turn now to look at what it means for the world, from Israel's war on Gaza to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. During his victory speech, Trump vowed that he was going to, quote, stop wars. But what will Trump's foreign policy actually look like?
We're joined now by Fatima Bhutto, award-winning author of several works of fiction and nonfiction, including The Runaways, New Kings of the World. She is co-editing a book along with Sonia Falero titled Gaza, The Story of a Genocide, due out next year. She writes a monthly column for Zeteo. Start off by just responding to Trump's runaway victory across the United States, Fatima.
Well, Amy, I don't think it's an aberration that he won. I think it's an aberration that he lost in 2020. And I think anyone looking at the American elections for the last year, even longer, could see very clearly that the Democrats were speaking to, I'm not sure who, to a hall of mirrors. They ran an incredibly weak and actually macabre campaign. To see Kamala Harris describe her politics as one of joy, as she promised the most lethal military in the world, talking about women's rights in America, essentially focusing those rights on the right to termination, while the rest of the world has watched women slaughtered in Gaza for 13 months straight. You know, it's very curious to think that they thought a winning strategy was Beyonce, and that Taylor Swift was somehow a political winning strategy that was going to defeat who? Trump, who was speaking to people, who was speaking against wars. You know, whether we believe him or not, it was a marked difference from what Kamala Harris was saying and was not saying.
And Fatima, you wrote a piece for Zeteo earlier this year titled Gaza has exposed the shameful hypocrisy of Western feminism. So you just mentioned the irony of Kamala Harris as, you know, the second presidential candidate who's a woman, where so much of the campaign was about women, and the fact that, you know, of what's been unfolding on women, against women and children in Gaza for the last year. If you could elaborate. Yeah, we've seen, I mean, over the last year, you know, 70% of those slaughtered in Gaza by Israel. And let's also be clear, by America, because it's American bombs and American diplomatic cover that allows this slaughter to continue unabated. 70% of those victims are women and children. We have watched children with their heads blown off. We have watched children with no surviving family members find themselves in hospital with limbs missing. Gaza has the largest cohort of child amputees in the world. And we have seen newborns left to die as Israel switches off electricity and fuel of hospitals. So for Kamala Harris to come out and talk repeatedly about abortion, and I say this as someone who is pro-choice, who has always been pro-choice, was not just macabre, but it's obscene. It's an absolute betrayal of feminism, because feminism is about liberation. It's not about termination, and it's about protecting women at their most vulnerable and at their most frightened. And there was no sign of that. You know, we also saw Kamala Harris bring out celebrities. I mean, the utter vacuousness of bringing out Jennifer Lopez, Beyonce, and others to talk about being a mother, while mothers are being widowed, are being orphaned in Gaza. It was not just tone deaf. It seemed to have a certain hostility, a certain contempt for the suffering that the rest of us have been watching. I'd also like to add to Robin's point about toxic masculinity, there was so much toxicity in Kamala Harris's campaign. You know, I watched her laugh with Oprah as she spoke about shooting someone who might enter her house with a gun, and giggling and saying her PR team may not like that, but she would kill them. You don't need to be a man to practice toxic masculinity, and you don't need to be white to practice white supremacy, as we've seen very clearly from this election cycle.
And yet, Fatima Bhutto, if you look at what Trump represented, and certainly the Muslim American community, the Arab American community, Jewish progressives, young people, African Americans, certainly understood what his Trump's policy was when he was president. And it's rare, president comes back to serve again after a term away. It's only happened once before in history. But you have, for example, Trump moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. You have an illegal settlement named after Trump in the West Bank. The whole question of Netanyahu and his right-wing allies in Israel pushing for annexation of the West Bank, where Trump would stand on this. And, of course, you have the Abraham Accords, which many Palestinians felt left them out completely. If you can talk about this, these were put forward by Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who, when the massive Gaza destruction was at its height, talked about Gaza as waterfront real estate.
Absolutely. There's no question that Trump has been a malign force, not just when it concerns Palestinians, but frankly, out in the world. But I would argue there's not very much difference between what these two administrations or parties do. The difference is that Trump doesn't have the gloss and the charisma of an Obama or, I mean, I can't even say that Biden has charisma, but certainly the gloss. Trump says it. They do it. The difference, I can't really tell the difference anymore. We saw the Biden administration send over 500 shipments of arms to Israel, betraying America's own laws, the fact that they are not allowed to export weapons of war to a country committing gross violations of human rights. We saw Bill Clinton trotted out in Michigan to tell Muslims that actually they should stop killing Israelis and that Jews were there before them. I mean, it was an utterly contemptuous speech. So what is the difference exactly? You know, we saw Bernie Sanders, who was mentioned earlier, write an op-ed in The Guardian in the days before the election, warning people that if they were not to vote for Kamala Harris, if Donald Trump was to get in, think about the climate crisis. Well, we've watched Israel's emissions in the first 5 months of their deadly attack on Gaza released more planet-warming gases into the atmosphere than 20 of the world's most climate-vulnerable nations released in a year. So I don't quite see that there is a difference between what Democrats allow and what Trump brags about. I think it's just a question of crudeness and decorum and politeness. One has it and one doesn't. In a sense, Trump is much clearer for the rest of the world because he says what he's going to do. And, you know, you take him at his word, whereas we have been gaslit and lied to by Anthony Blinken on a daily basis now since October 7th. Every time that AOC or Kamala Harris spoke about fighting desperately for a ceasefire, we saw more carnage, more massacres, and Israel committing crimes with total impunity. You know, it wasn't under Trump that Israel has killed more journalists than have ever been killed in any recorded conflict. It's under Biden that Israel has killed more UN workers than have ever been killed in the UN's history. So I'm not sure there's a difference. And, you know, we'll have to wait to see in the months ahead. But I don't think anyone is bracing for an upturn. Certainly people didn't vote for Kamala Harris. I'm not sure they voted for Trump. We know that she lost 14 million votes from Biden's win in 2020. And we know that those votes just didn't come out for the Democrats. Some may have migrated to Trump. Some may have gone to third parties. But 14 million just didn't go anywhere.
So, Fatima, if you could, you know, tell us what do you think the reasons are for that? I mean, the kind of, as you said, because it is really horrifying what has unfolded in Gaza in the last 13 months. You've written about this. You now have an edited anthology that you're editing, co-editing. You know, what do you think accounts for this? The sheer disregard for the lives of tens of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed in Gaza?
It's a total racism on the part, not just of America, but I'm speaking of the West here. This has been betrayed over the last year. The fact that Ukraine is spoken about with an admiration, you know, Zelensky is spoken about with a sort of hero worship. Ukrainian resistors to Russia's invasion are valorized. You know, Nancy Pelosi wore a bracelet of bullets used by the Ukrainian resistance against Trump. But Palestinians are painted as terrorists, are dehumanized to such an extent. You know, we saw that dehumanization from the mouths of Bill Clinton, no less. from the mouths of Kamala Harris, who interrupted somebody speaking out against the genocide and saying, I'm speaking. What is more toxically masculine than that? We've also seen a concerted crackdown in universities across the United States on college students. I'm speaking also here of my own alma mater of Columbia University, of Barnard College, that called the NYPD, who fired live ammunition at their students. You know, this didn't happen. This extreme response didn't happen in protests against apartheid. It didn't happen in protests against Vietnam in quite the same way. And all I can think is America and the West, who have been fighting Muslim countries for the last 25, 30 years, see it as acceptable to do so. Our deaths are acceptable to them, and genocide is not a red line. And, you know, to go back to what Robin mentioned earlier about the working class that is absolutely ignored in America, and I would make the argument across the West too, they have watched administration after, president and congressman give billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine while they have no relief at home. They have no relief from debt. They have no relief from student debt. They have no medical care, no coverage. They're struggling to survive. And this is across the board. And after Ukraine, they saw billions go to Israel in the same way, while they get, frankly, nothing.
Fatima Bhutto, we want to thank you so much for being with us, award-winning author of a number of works of fiction and nonfiction, including The Runaways and New Kings of the World, co-editing a book called Gaza, the Story of a Genocide, due out next year. Writes a monthly column for Zateo.